you.
Thanks, Ashley. Well, this evening we have a presentation on plastics and by Rebekah Creshkoff. And it just brought to mind about 50 years ago, I saw a movie called The Graduate. And there was one line that struck me as a college student was Benjamin was a graduate and his future father-in-law was giving him some advice on occupation. And he said, the future is in plastics. And that line stuck with me. So when we were able to have Rebekah down to talk about plastics, I lead you with that.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Yes, those of us who are in the sorry, my husband wants me to record this. He's not feeling well. So those of us who are in the plastics business think and hear about The Graduate a lot, as you might imagine. So thank you very much, Aaron, and thank you, Lori, for inviting me. Really appreciate it. I'm here today on behalf of Beyond Plastics, a scrappy little nonprofit whose audacious goal is to end plastic pollution everywhere. I didn't mean to do that just yet. My name is Rebekah Creshkoff, and I'm a recovering corporate apologist. I served time, 30 years to be precise, working in communications at, oh, so the mouse is not going to work. I have to go like this. There we go. At one of the top 20 Fortune 500 companies. I have to adjust. I'm going to have to stand with my butt cheek. This is You're used to it, huh? Okay. So here I am with the big boss, Jamie Dimon. My job was to make employees love him, and I was good at it. My husband teased me about working for the propaganda department, but work wasn't the only thing I did. I got up early in the morning and checked buildings for migrating birds that had crashed into windows and been injured or killed. Other volunteers joined me, and now Project Safe Flight is one of New York City Audubon's signature programs. I also had another quirky passion. I was incredibly attuned to plastic bags and took off like a dog chasing a squirrel whenever I saw one roaming down the street. Other plastic offended me too. So imagine my horror one night when, after our Chinese takeout dinner, oh, how my husband misses Empire Szechuan, I realized that rather than Project Safe Flight, my longest lasting legacy would be the plastic I've used over the course of my lifetime. Which leads me to another story. Once upon a time, not so very long ago, there was a terrible war. With raw materials in short supply, manufacturers turned to synthetics. The plastics industry really came of age during World War II. Synthetics were deployed across the entire range of military equipment and supplies. US plastic production increased by 300% during the war, but manufacturers knew that once it was over, they'd have to find peacetime markets. I forgot to click and click and click there. Am I blocking the screen for you? Everybody's good? Okay. So Dow ran advertising on the home front, touting their wondrous new materials. Their wartime tagline, indispensable to industry and victory. But it wasn't clear that consumers would buy plastic goods. Plastic had a bad rap. It smelled strange, couldn't be mended when it broke, and melted when heated. It was time to launch an aggressive marketing campaign. The industry became one of Madison Avenue's biggest clients. Women's magazines printed special issues dedicated to plastics and even sent an 11-page booklet to 12,000 home economics teachers around the country. Soon plastics became as American as apple pie. Those of us born after World War II have lived our entire lives surrounded by plastic, which makes it difficult for us to even recognize. There's the American as apple pie. Like a fish in water, we can't even see it because it constitutes the environment in which we live. But we need to get better at recognizing plastic because it has impacts that go far beyond unsightly litter. One of them looks like this. But what does plastic have to do with climate change? A lot. That's because plastics are made from fossil fuels. And these days in the US, most of it is made from a byproduct of fracked gas. I didn't need to tell anyone here about fracking, but you may not know that there is dry gas and wet gas. In our area, we have dry gas, which comes to the surface virtually ready for market. But the wet gas in Western Pennsylvania contains other liquid compounds that must be separated out first. One of these is ethane, which used to be just flared off. Nowadays, that ethane is captured and sent via pipelines to an ethane cracker facility. Cracking is the term chemists use for the process of breaking molecular bonds in complex hydrocarbons to create simpler ones. Because the carbon-carbon bond is very strong. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. There we go. The carbon-carbon bond is very strong. The process requires extremely high temperatures. Ethane cracks at 1650 degrees Fahrenheit, creating ethylene, the basic building block in most plastics. Add pressure and a catalyst, and you get polyethylene, which is extruded and cut into little pellets. These tiny pellets are the feedstock for more than 65% of global plastic production, as measured by weight, and go into everything from auto parts to zippers, but especially single-use items. It takes 1,000 of these pellets to make a single water bottle, a disposable water bottle. An estimated 42% of plastic produced today is used to make packaging that's designed to be used only briefly before being discarded. Most virgin plastic now goes into making containers, cups, packaging, plastic bags, straws, forks, plates, gift cards, vapes, e-cigarettes, and cigarette filters, which consist of tiny plastic fibers all around the world. Oops. Cigarette butts are the most common type of plastic waste. So of that $6 billion, $1,650,000,000 of that $6 billion came out of taxpayers' pockets, the largest subsidy in the state's history. PA people here. But new crackers aren't coming just to Western Pennsylvania. This map shows new petrochemical and plastics infrastructure projects or expansions approved or announced since 2012. At least 90 such proposals have been advanced over the last decade, including 42 major construction projects. So why is the fossil fuel industry investing so heavily in plastics? The increasing popularity of electric cars and renewables mean they're losing market share in the transportation and energy sectors. According to the International Energy Agency, renewables are set to overtake coal to become the world's largest source of electricity by early 2025. To hedge their bets, the fossil fuel industry is ramping up plastic production. This is their plan B. But plastic is not carbon neutral. If plastic were a country, it'd be the world's 5th largest emitter of greenhouse gases. Plastic generates greenhouse gases at every stage of its life cycle, with fossil extraction through resin production accounting for more than 60% of its emissions. Cracking alone requires huge amounts of power. The new Shell plant has a permit that allows it to emit as much CO2 annually as 480,000 cars a year. That's equivalent to driving more than 5.5 billion miles with an all-gas vehicle. If all these new projects are built, we may be unable to avoid the worst impacts of climate change because big corporations don't just walk away from multi-billion-dollar investments. They don't want to wind up with stranded assets. Their business model commits them to making and selling ever more plastic. But this is nothing new. Even in the mid-1950s, the industry looked to grow not by moving plastic into people's homes, but through them. As the editor of Modern Packaging magazine wrote at the time, the future is in the trash can. But while the disposable phenomenon is not new, it's been accelerating almost exponentially. More than half of all the plastic ever manufactured has been made since 2002. Remember, 42% of plastic produced today goes to make packaging, and the industry keeps on finding new things to wrap in it. As consumers, we cannot escape plastic, and the industry knows that plenty of us feel guilty about buying so much of it. That's why they've engaged in an aggressive, decades-long campaign to convince us that plastic recycling works. Historical tangent here. The iconic recycling symbol was created in 1970 by a 23-year-old architecture student, Gary Anderson, for a design competition. 18 years later, the Society of the Plastics Industry appropriated the 3 chasing arrows for their resin identification system. An ingenious marketing move because it suggested that any item with a symbol could be recycled. Most of us remain convinced these simple symbols mean an item is recyclable. The industry has duped us into being not just willing, but eager partners in keeping plastic moving through our homes. If you're like me a couple of years ago, you comfort yourself by thinking, well, at least it's recyclable. Wrong. No matter what your community or waste hauler tells you, only number 1 PET bottles and number 2 HDPE bottles and jugs, and possibly number 5 polypropylene containers, like yogurt containers, have a realistic chance of getting recycled. That's because they're the only types of post-consumer plastic for which there are markets. And even number 1 and number 2 plastics generally aren't recycled into new bottles and jugs. Instead, they are largely downcycled into carpeting and fleece fabric, which kind of sounds like upcycling, right? But it actually just serves to keep more single-use plastic moving through our homes. As for other types of plastic, it's more cost-effective for producers to buy virgin resin because polyethylene pellets are so cheap. No one's going to use recycled plastic if they're losing money on it. So what actually happens with all our other plastic? Typically, it winds up getting burned, generally in a waste-to-energy facility if there's one close by, or they go to a cement kiln, either one of which might sound like a good thing. Hey, at least they're getting energy out of it, but it actually isn't, because these facilities release toxic pollutants as well as greenhouse gases. The sad truth is plastics recycling has been an abysmal failure. In the US, our annual recycling rate for post-consumer plastic waste has never hit double digits. In 2021, it was less than 6%. That's down from an air quotes high of 9.5% in 2014, when we counted the millions of tons of plastic we sent to China as recycled, even though much of it actually wasn't. It's not just the US. Plastic recycling rates are lackluster the world over. Globally, only 9% of the plastic is recycled, while 22% is mismanaged. This catchier graphic rounds up to 10%. What isn't landfilled or incinerated often gets swept into creeks and rivers, and eventually the ocean. This range is conservative and based on old data, but even 8 million metric tons a year works out to a garbage truck's worth of plastic every minute for an entire year. At that rate, just 2 years from now, there'll be 1 pound of plastics for every 3 pounds of fish in the sea. By 2050, the ratio will be 1 to 1. We are turning our oceans into a landfill, which is profoundly affecting the more than 3 billion people who depend on the sea for their livelihood. And of course, all this plastic is not good for sea creatures, which become entangled in or ingest plastic. Worldwide, 5 trillion plastic bags are used every year, more than 1 million a minute. Again? Good to go? Plastic debris in the ocean attracts zooplankton to its surface, which makes it smell like food. Deceived by the scent, this albatross ate plastic bottle caps, which it could neither digest nor pass, and so it starved to death. I will spare you more gruesome pictures. There are many, but over 700 different species have been found to be negatively impacted by plastic waste in the ocean. Of course, all these plastic bottles don't remain intact for long. They become brittle in sunlight and are abraded by wave action. While plastic doesn't break down, it does break up into ever smaller fragments. And you may have seen headlines like these a month ago. Researchers now estimate that there are more than 170 trillion bits of plastic in the oceans, describing it as a plastic smog. And of course, tiny fragments of plastic aren't just in the ocean. Microplastics have been found on Mount Everest and in the Mariana Trench. They've been found in the air, water, soil, and rainwater. They've been found in snowflakes. This purple fiber could have come from the fleece pullover I've had for more than 30 years. I stopped wearing it once I saw this snowflake photo. Indeed, in many studies, fibers from synthetic fabrics are the top microplastic found in the environment, including in the USGS study of the upper Delaware that came out a couple of years ago. Microplastics are found in soils where they are taken up by crops. Here's one in the root of a wheat plant. They are in the food chain and inside us. Each week, everyone, everywhere in the world eats, drinks, or inhales 5 grams of plastic. That's equivalent to a credit card, 52 times a year. In effect, we are eating our own waste. Now, is ingesting microplastics bad for us? Researchers have only begun looking into this, but we do know for sure that many of the chemicals used to make plastics are. Remember, plastic is made from fossil fuels and synthetic chemicals. It's the added chemicals that give plastics their useful attributes, like flexibility, durability, rigidity, or heat resistance. On their own, polymers are just a goopy mess, so it takes a lot of additives to do the job. Any given plastics item is about 50-50 polymers and chemicals. Some of these chemicals were on the freight train that derailed in East Palestine, Ohio in early February, including the highly toxic vinyl chloride, which is used only to make plastics. As for the polymer half of plastics, it forms a backbone made up of those strong carbon-carbon bonds. But the chemical additives are not actually attached at a molecular level. They just sit between the folds. Since they are not tightly bound to the material, they don't stay put. And these chemicals are not inert. If there's one thing you take away from this talk, it should be that plastics are not inert. Our bodies are constantly exposed to thousands of chemicals that leach from plastic, some of which we know are harmful to humans, to human health. A number of them, like bisphenols, phthalates, and brominated flame retardants, are endocrine disruptors. Minuscule amounts of these compounds can hack the endocrine system and scramble hormone messages. They have been linked to ADHD, behavioral problems, lower IQ, and depressed immune function, as well as autism spectrum disorder, reproductive issues, obesity, diabetes, and cancer. The authors of a 2021 study conservatively estimated that phthalates alone are responsible for 100,000 premature deaths in the US each year. If researchers were to conduct a study that deliberately exposed humans to a host of different chemicals, including known toxins, it would be considered unethical in the extreme. And yet, that is what is happening to all of us every day of our lives, starting even before we are born. Then there are substances that are unintentionally added to plastics. Most, if not all, plastics are contaminated with PFAS. Per and polyfluoroalkyl substances are a class of more than 9,000 compounds called forever chemicals because they don't break down and they persist in the environment. They too have been linked to a range of harmful health effects. And while they are deliberately added to things like waterproof clothing and takeout containers, researchers are finding them in more and more products because manufacturers use PFAS on their machinery as a lubricant. Similarly, all plastics are contaminated with flame retardants, which are applied to the machinery so the plastic doesn't catch fire. After all, plastics are made from fossil fuels. And like other fossil fuels, they spill. And when they do, it makes a big mess. Remember these tiny beads of plastic resin? In the industry, they're called nurdles. That's Nurdles. Because they're so tiny, they are prone to spilling whenever they're moved. In May of 2021, a container ship, the Express Pearl, caught fire off the coast of Colombo, Sri Lanka. It burned for 2 weeks and finally sank as it was towed out to sea. The worst environmental damage came not from heavy fuel oil or hazardous chemicals, but from 87 shipping containers filled with nearly 1,800 tons of nurdles. It was the largest plastic spill the world has seen to date. Sri Lanka launched a massive cleanup effort. It was a Sisyphean task. Shorelines were covered with nurdles up to 6.5 feet deep. And nurdles continue to wash ashore in new places today. And thanks to plastic's strong carbon backbone, they will continue to circulate in ocean currents for decades to come, releasing their toxic payload wherever they go, including inside the fish, seabirds, turtles, and other wildlife that mistake these tiny pellets for food. They look like fish eggs, and like other plastic debris, they attract zooplankton to their surface and come to smell like food too. Those that aren't consumed by animals will, over time, fragment into microscopic particles and be ingested by plankton, the base of the entire marine food chain. More than 250,000 tons of nurdles end up in the ocean every year. Over 8 gigatons, that's 8 billion tons of plastics have been made since 1950. That's equivalent to 55 million jumbo jets. Only 9% of it has been recycled. Most of it still exists today. The mass of plastics mankind has made is twice that of all animals on Earth, mammals, including us, birds, fish, herps, and insects. So what can we do about all this? Well, we can't fix this problem overnight. We can start to make it better by not making it any worse. First, a huge shout out to everyone who organizes and participates in the UDC's litter sweep. You are actively keeping plastic waste from deteriorating any further into the environment and escaping into our soils and oceans. But to really make a dent, we can't focus on just cleaning up litter after the fact. We need to prevent it from happening in the first place. To stop plastic pollution, we need to stop making so much plastic. And since 42% of the plastic produced today goes to make packaging, that's where we need to zero in. It won't be easy. The industry struck gold when they got us addicted to disposable plastic, and they struck gold again when they convinced us that recycling was a viable way to manage plastic waste. So they're going to fight back. And while making changes in our own lives is all well and good, we need to tackle this beast, not just through our personal choices, but through policy change. Beyond Plastics supports a policy called Extended Producer Responsibility, also known as Effective Packaging Reduction, which makes producers legally and financially responsible for mitigating the end-of-life impacts of their products and packaging. In a nutshell, you make it, you take it. It's a big shift from our current linear model, where municipalities and taxpayers are left holding the bag. The goal is to incentivize waste reduction and packaging redesign. But packaging reduction is tricky and complex, so it's important to do it right. Legislation needs to include specific reduction requirements and standards for recyclability. And it's essential to eliminate toxic substances from packaging, particularly food packaging. 4 states, Oregon, Maine, California, and Colorado, have already passed packaging reduction laws, and a couple of bills have been introduced in New York State. At the federal level, the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act will shortly be reintroduced. It mainly focuses on packaging reduction. But what I really like is that it calls for a pause on new plastic producing facilities. You can help push for policy change. Start by joining Beyond Plastic's mailing list. They've also developed a whole set of easy to implement grassroots actions you can take in your own community. And to really make an impact, join the local groups and affiliates program. To help you get started, Beyond Plastics offers free online training sessions. It's 4 hours over 2 days, and you can mix and match whichever time slots work for you. The next series will be held in May. And I encourage you to keep on learning. Later this month, Judith Enck, founder and president of Beyond Plastics, will be holding her excellent 7-week class. I've taken it twice. And please follow us. Thank you all very much. Here's how you can reach me.